So, hi everyone. Today we have the pleasure of discussing Lisa Herzog's book, The Democratic Marketplace: How a Moral Equal Economy Can Save Our Political Ideals. And we will also hear from Tom Parr and Julie Rose. The structure of today's session is that Lisa Herzog will start by introducing the book. She'll be followed by comments from Tom Parr and a brief reply then by Lisa. We'll then have a Q&A before the break. After the 10-minute break, Julie Rose will provide comments, followed again by a short reply by Lisa Herzog, and we'll finish with a Q&A. Thanks again for everyone for joining us today. I will pass it on to Caleb, who will introduce today's speakers.
Great, thanks, Katarina. So as Katarina said, today we're honored to be joined by three prominent academics. So first, Lisa Herzog, whose book we're discussing works at the intersection of political philosophy and economic thought. She's held her position at the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Groningen since 2019. And Lisa has published on the philosophical dimensions of markets, liberalism and social justice, ethics in organizations, and the future of work. And she's also a co-editor of the interdisciplinary journal Review of Social Economy. We then have our two commentators. So the first of whom, Tom Parr, who's a reader in political theory in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. He's held previous positions at the University of Essex, Graz University, Princeton University, and Universitat Pompeu Fabra. He's editor-in-chief of Law, Ethics, and Philosophy, and his latest book, Empowering Workers in an Age of Automation, was published with OUP in 2025. His current research draws on insights from philosophy, politics, and economics to explore how labor market policymakers should respond to the threats and opportunities associated with technological change, including those associated with automation and AI. So today, Tom will be focusing most of his comments on the chapter on workers. And then our second commentator is Julie Rose. So Julie is an associate professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College. Her primary area of research and teaching is contemporary political philosophy with a focus on questions of economic justice. Her research addresses the ethical dimensions of our collective economic choices. She's interested in issues of distributive and social justice, justice and work, environmental ethics, and gender and family justice. In her first book, Free Time, published with Princeton University Press, she argues that all citizens are entitled, as a matter of justice, to fair shares of free time. Her current research includes a series of papers about issues of work, leisure, and economic growth. So today, Julie will be focusing her comments on the chapter Time for Democracy. Okay, with that introductory spiel out the way, I'll hand it over to Lisa, who can begin introducing her book.
Well, thank you all so much, to the organizers, to the commentators, and to all of you for being here. I have the task of talking about the book in 20 minutes, which is what I myself suggested, so we have more time for discussion, but that will be a bit hard because I will only be able to talk really about some of the main lines of what the book is trying to do. It's funny because I wrote it as a kind of thing in between a purely academic and a public audience book, and it seems that in the Anglophone sphere, it's being perceived as an academic book, and in the Dutch translation, it was actually more perceived as a public audience book. And I presented some ideas in Sweden the other day, and the reaction was sort of, yeah, that's all good old social democracy. We have this, we need more, but what's new here? So it was originally written for an mostly, Anglophone audience where they have the more liberal type of capitalism, to also say something about, what is the relation between that and what's going on with the democracies there. So I'll briefly run over the main argument, so the introduction, and then I'll have very little time left to focus on the two chapters. But thanks to Tom and Julie, we'll get into more details later. So the first basic point is that I want to challenge this assumption that democracy and capitalism are something that goes together naturally. They've often been presented as this kind of successful power couple of the West. You may remember the claim by Fukuyama about the end of history in the 90s. We now know how to organize complex modern societies by having democracy and capitalism. He took this back. My perspective is that this is not true, and we actually have a choice to make, because if we don't bring our democratic systems more in line with democratic values, we are at risk of losing our democracies. Current thinking about these things is very much separated into different spheres, and you see this also in different academic disciplines, and people always tend to keep things in the other sphere constant, and then they talk, for example, about party politics or about distrust in institutions in political science, analyzing the political sphere, which in principle is meant to be guided by democratic principles. And then on the other hand, you have people doing work on the economic sphere in economics, where you hold the political system constant and you discuss how is growth developing, what are labor markets doing, and so on. And in many of the models that economists use, efficiency is a kind of deeply ingrained underlying value without that ever being really thematized. It's just taken for granted that that's the right thing to do. This is a very brief summary, as I said. So basically, the separation of spheres doesn't work, in my view. It got us the huge inequality that we see, the ecological problems. And there are also many threats to social cohesion. There's polarization, there's a perception that somehow social ties are not as strong anymore. And I think in order to really understand what's going on there, we need to look exactly at the intersection or the overlap of the interferences between the political and the economic sphere. We cannot just pretend that these are two worlds and one will not be affected by the other. In fact, it's not completely true that they have not been in touch, because one thing that happened in the last decades is also that economic thinking, and specifically a rational choice approach to human behavior, has actually changed our understanding of what democracy even is, reducing it from active citizenship and self-government to a model where you have to choose between different parties as a voter, which is modeled with exactly the same conceptual tools and mathematical tools that are also used for people choosing between goods and the market. And I think that is in itself problematic, because it gives you a very narrow picture of democracy. Now, talking about these things, you might...
Sorry, Lisa. We don't see the slides moving on our end. I don't know if
Oh
you've
my
been...
God, apologies
Sorry.
about that. What
You might
can
have
I
the
do?
wrong monitor.
Let me stop sharing and share again. I don't know why that is. What do you see now?
That's better, I think. Yep.
Yeah,
We
you
Yeah,
can
see
well, I have...
Battle of
okay.
the Isms. Yep.
Yes, exactly. So that's where I was in terms of content. Everyone working in this field will probably recognize this. As soon as you say something about economics and politics and so on, you get a question about, yeah, but is this then socialism, or is it capitalism, or what is it? And I've come to think that this is an incredibly unhelpful way of thinking about this topic, because different authors mean very different things. So when American politicians talk about socialism, what they mean is typically social democracy of a pretty middle of the road type in many European countries. And it's also an unhelpful dichotomy that we've basically inherited from the Cold War era, where there are certain assumptions about what institutional solutions need to go together to make it one or the other camp. And also, politically speaking, I think it makes us overlook that there are certain shared premises between people who otherwise have very different views that could be used for rethinking the economy. And as an example that I discuss in the book, let me just briefly mention that you have lots of libertarians who are enthusiastic about markets, but they are very much against what they call crony capitalism. And the phenomena they describe, that rich, powerful companies dominate markets, that's very similar to what many left critics would describe as domination and then exploitation flowing from it and so on. And I mean, part of my background commitment is that ultimately we need to convince citizens of these things. There cannot be a kind of, philosopher king model of bringing about reform. Maybe it needs to be revolution, not reform anyway, but in any case, it needs to be broadly understood. And so we also need to think about who are the people who would share some of the premises. Doesn't have to be perfect overlap in order to think about this together. My starting point is that I'm asking, well, let's assume that we all agree on a certain picture of democracy as something that is more than just yet another market where you go and vote with your vote and not your money in this case. But that democracy needs to be a kind of way of life where you have some degree of active participation, at least those who want it, not just having to choose between technocratic proposals. And where democratic values are also embedded in daily life, where you can experience what it means to be treated as a democratic citizen, as equal among equals, and how we live together, how we treat each other. And that means that deliberation and participation and decision-making are part of what we mean when we say democracy, and not just a kind of Schumpeterian picture where you can, every 4 years, vote for a different set of overlords. Now, of course, I'm not alone with criticisms of the economic system, and the Visions of the Future project is, of course, aiming at inventorizing and comparing and evaluating many of the proposals that are out there. So in that sense, what I say here on the slides, that there are no alternative proposals, that's not quite true. There's a kind of mushrooming of different ideas. But I would argue that if you want to come to a new economic system, you also need to be explicit about the values behind it. And not all of the proposals that are out there are always explicit. My suggestion in the book is, let's take the democratic values that we agree on, at least officially, when it comes to politics, and let's use those for thinking also about the economy. And these key democratic values include the equal moral status of all members of society, mutual respect, certain degree of reciprocity. And let's not pretend that the economy is this completely separate sphere where a completely different logic needs to rule, but let's ask what happens if those values are also meant to be implemented in the economic system. And that leads to a couple of institutional questions that I then discuss in the different chapters of the book. What kind of markets, if any, would you want to have in a truly democratic society? And I distinguish between productive and extractive forms of exchange. What kind of companies would you want? And we'll get to that chapter in a minute. Would you want to continue to grow the economy, or would you want to move to a post-growth scenario? And here I suggest that these two camps are actually not as different as they often sound when it comes to policy proposals. And we should think about the economy much more in terms of the functions that we wanted to fulfill. And then, and that's also something I'm going to delve into a bit deeper in a minute, what kind of time politics? What are we actually spending our time on? From a democratic perspective, what should we want here? And to put this in a provocative question, do we actually have enough time for democracy, or do we make enough time for democracy? That is the very short version of the overall argument. And now I'll delve a bit. Are the slides moving forward? Yes. I'll delve into the chapter on workers, again, very briefly, but I'm sure that we'll get into more details in discussion with Tom. So in today's labor markets, you often find that people have to choose between two evils, as it were. They either have to submit under hierarchies when they have a normal job. Of course, in Europe, there is some degree of representation of workers in company boards, but in many other countries, you just get your job and you have to obey orders. And that's also how lots of economists would theorize corporations. And if you don't like this, the alternative option, I mean, unless you're independently rich, is that you find some kind of way of earning a living in the gig economy, but typically you'd end up in a pretty precarious position, stitching together income from different sources, online, offline, whatever. And it's often also underpaid massively. Now, in the chapter, I developed what I would describe as a democratic perspective of work, where it's a contribution to a kind of synergistic whole in which value is really being produced together. And we cannot even say in a meaningful way, that person has produced that much value and that other person has produced the other amount of value, because it all depends on what other people do. And it's really value creation that also builds on achievements from the past, and that happens together. And then in this synergistical, the question is, well, what democratic values then matter? And the first basic but practically difficult one is, well, work shouldn't harm workers. And when you think about what kind of, for example, psychological and mental health issues can arise from many forms of work these days, then you see that this is one of the issues where, philosophically speaking, morally speaking, it's very easy to say there shouldn't be harm to individual workers, but ensuring this is really a very great practical challenge. How do you do this? Also, you want to have basic standards of fairness between the different participants in this system. And that means that you wouldn't want discrimination along lines of race or gender or what have you. I would argue for a minimum wage, because no form of work that we see today is so meaningless that only bargaining power between parties should determine what it is paid for. And there should also be opportunities for development for all workers. So what you often have these days is that people are stuck in certain lines of work, and if they are lucky at the beginning of their lives, they end up in a good job, and if they are unlucky at the beginning of their life, at least it becomes much harder for them to ever make their way into different lines of work where they could maybe, have more alignment with their own personal interests. That's sort of this minimum, and I think that's something that lots of liberal egalitarians would agree to. But from a democratic perspective, what I want to add is that workers should also have a say in the organization of their work. So this is an endorsement of workplace democracy, not only in the sense that you can give some feedback on the color in which the walls of the canteen will be painted, but that you really have a meaningful, powerful voice, and you can maybe also have veto rights. It depends on the constellation in how the work gets done. And lots of arguments about this. We'll get to this with Tom, I guess. What can it mean in practice? What I suggest is a kind of a toolbox approach. I don't think there's one model of economic democracy, workplace democracy that would work everywhere, but there are different models that can work for different workplaces. And what's very important, I think, is there is also an epistemic perspective here, which is to say, through more democratic approaches, you can make use of everyone's knowledge and perspectives, and that can often lead to better results and ultimately also make the work efficient in a strictly economic sense. So you don't even lose what you think the hierarchies without any worker power might want to give you. What are the institutional implications? Well, one sort of power question is very much about the role of unions. I'm in favor of sectorial unionization, not at the level of individual companies. One model in this toolbox approach is co-determination, but it depends very much on what rights the worker representatives then actually get. Another model is worker cooperatives. And there are also lots of participatory forms that can happen within companies, for example, self-governing teams. And in order to make this all a reality that is really meaningful for people, as an accompanying measure, I also argue for a job guarantee that would create a kind of lower floor in the labor market in terms of pay, but also in terms of working conditions. That's the chapter on workers, very briefly. And now I move to the chapter on time for democracy. Now, here, I start by reflecting a little bit on some of the classic texts in this area. And one that you may know is from Keynes, who wrote in 1930 about economic possibilities for our grandchildren. And if you calculate 1930 grandchildren, you take sort of 30-year generations, 2 generations, we should long be there. And we are not there, because what he predicted was that there would be 15 hours work per week for those generations. Now, there's lots of interesting research on why that has actually not happened. We can get to this. But from a philosophical perspective, there is a lot to be said for the value of free time. Economists tend to focus on the welfare effects of free time. So Juliet Schroer has done a lot of work on this. And Julie has written a wonderful book from which I've learned a lot about how important it's also to have free time and also coordinated free time together with others for realizing individual rights. For example, the right to exercise freely your religion, if you don't have time to do so and time together with others, what does it even mean? And to that, I want to add that we also need more time to be democratic citizens. And work time, understood in this way, is not just a matter of individual choices. And there are actually lots of sociological arguments that you can use for thinking that it's really a matter of the political rule setting, because you have lots of coordination issues. There's a power question here. And of course, the labor movement in the past has for decades fought for lower work time, sort of stopped in the 80s, has been a little bit flaring up recently. But again, from a democratic perspective, I think this topic matters. Now, one way in which it matters is that time that we don't have to spend in paid work is for many people also time for care work. So it's not free time in the sense of doing what you want, but many people use it to care for family members or for other things and for other people, for other issues, for organizations. So I would understand care really in a very broad sense. And these are, of course, essential contributions to society. I mean, imagine what it would be like if that work wasn't done. I mean, the women's strikes that you sometimes saw in Iceland or in Spain have showed a little bit what happens if that kind of work doesn't get done. From a democratic perspective, I think that time needs to be taken seriously and it needs to be understood as an important contribution to society. But in addition, I think people should have time in their lives for the various commons that we have, the commons in your local neighborhood or your village or your sports club or some kind of artistic association. So the concept of commons is useful for thinking about the need to take care of these units. And you can understand this as public work or civic work, but I think that's something that lots of people also experience as very meaningful. And there is this famous argument about how if you have democratic workplaces, you learn how to be a good democratic citizens, and that has been called the spillover argument. But in today's world, it's just not realistic that it will so quickly move to democratic workplaces for everyone. So you might also say, well, that's why people should have democratic experiences in working together with others in public work, so that there can be a spillover from those experiences to democracy at large. And last but not least, I think if people are able to do different things in their life, that also creates societal resilience in times of crisis. And the example that I use in the book is the influx of refugees in Berlin, which really would not have worked at all if there hadn't been loads of volunteers taking care of these people. Very briefly, I often get the objection that for lack of a better word, I've called it the Netflix objection. Wouldn't people just watch Netflix? And I think, yes, maybe to some extent that's also okay because people need to relax. But I think there are also reasons to think that public engagement could actually be stabilized. And in many societies, you do see a lot of volunteering. One reason is that it is very attractive to make a meaningful contribution, and especially people who don't see their own work as very meaningful might actually really enjoy this. The team spirit, I think, matters a lot because it's a matter of doing things together. But it needs to happen under conditions where people can also see that overall they are being treated fairly in society, and it becomes a matter of reciprocity that you would also say, okay, I want to spend a certain amount of my time on something that helps the common good in some way. How could this be implemented? I'm quite interested in all the economic experiments about the 4-day work week, and then you could have of the additional day that you gain, you could have half a day for Netflix or your family or whatever, and half a day for some other activities maybe. But I think there's also many questions about giving people the opportunity to, for example, take off a paid sabbatical for a particular purpose, for example, to run for office. So that would be maybe an avenue for getting more working class people into politics. Very briefly at the end, I think the next question that then raises itself, and that's something I've started to think about now, is how this could look like over people's lifetime. So what would be the distribution of paid and unpaid work and civic work and volunteering and so on over your life? But that's something for the future. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. This was right within time, super condensed. Thank you. So now we have the chance of listening to Tom Parr. So you can provide your comments up to 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'll just, can you see my slides here?
Can. It's still not in presenting mode. I'm not sure if you want to do that. But
Like that?
it's perfect.
Okay. Great, 20 minutes. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks so much, Lisa, for writing the book, for the organizers, for people turning up. It's been great having an opportunity to study Lisa's book a little bit more carefully and to try to work through some of my reactions to it. So at the outset, in the opening pages, Lisa describes some kind of guiding commitments that inform the resulting analysis. So she argues that a democratic society is one that honors a commitment to the moral equality of citizens and in which individuals govern society in a democratic way. So these rather minimal commitments, from that, Lisa then infers some quite demanding particular requirements on the design of our social and economic institutions, including labor markets, emphasizing that these markets need to be designed in ways that don't undermine the guiding commitments, and indeed that they need to be promoted. What that means in practice is twofold for Lisa. So first, the chapter involves a kind of diagnosis of the injustice of prevailing arrangements or institutions. And here Lisa defends the relevance of the fact that in many workplaces, bosses are not elected but appointed from above, and they often decide about much more than just the allocation of tasks in teams. They decide about whether someone keeps their job at all, bonuses, promotions, often without accountability to workers. So Lisa is, at a fundamental level, I think, concerned about the undemocratic nature of modern labor markets or modern workplaces, and in particular, the kind of inequality of workplace authority that characterizes these workplaces. As Lisa noted in her little introduction, then, the reality for many workers is submission to authority, working in these undemocratic workplaces, or, if they prefer, avoiding this submission to hierarchy and authority, but at the cost of a stable source of income, and instead living in precarity, in working in the gig economy, for example. So that's the kind of the diagnosis that lies at the heart of Lisa's chapter. And then it gives rise, I think, to some prescriptions in the second part of the chapter. So these are prescriptions designed to ameliorate the injustices that she identifies. And in addition to some familiar kind of mechanisms, like protecting workers from very serious forms of harm, where Lisa notes that there are lots of practical difficulties in achieving this, the more theoretically controversial or contentious part of the analysis is with respect to her defense of democratizing workplaces. So again, Lisa noted in her little introduction here, this is in supporting the democratization of workplaces. This is where she kind of goes beyond more familiar institutional responses that are defended by a host of liberal egalitarians. In particular, Lisa defends the use of trade unions, co-determination, workers' cooperatives, and so on. There's a kind of a toolbox, a variety of initiatives in this space that can serve that purpose. In the analysis, in my commentary now, I'll focus predominantly on that more contentious part of Lisa's prescriptions. Okay, so in the time that I have, I want to present 4 challenges to Lisa's view, to the argument she presents in this chapter. These challenges, I think, increase in seriousness. So the initial 2 are really more clarifications and invitations for Lisa to say more about her view. And the second and third, I think, raise, or at least identify points of disagreement between us, perhaps. So the first challenge relates to the diagnosis that Lisa offers. The second relates to the relationship of the diagnosis to the prescription. The third relates to the content of that prescription. And fourth relates to the overall argument and something that might be missing from that argument. The range and nature, I want to emphasize that the range and nature of these challenges merely reflects the ambitiousness of Lisa's book. So again, this is a book that has theoretical components, integrates these with empirical analysis of labor markets in order both to diagnose the injustice of a range of social and economic institutions, including labor markets, but also to recommend a host of reforms. So it's a really wide-ranging book and a wide-ranging chapter. For that reason, perhaps it's no surprise that there are lots of questions that crop up. Okay, so the first challenge. Lisa's diagnosis takes as a starting point, as I've noted, that bosses are not elected, but appointed from above. She thinks that this fact matters because it illuminates the fact that many workers have to submit to the authority of their bosses in a hierarchical workplace arrangement. And Lisa thinks that this kind of, this fact of submission, or rather the fact of submission where the only alternative to that is an unreasonable one, precarity, is a deeply troubling fact. So should we share Lisa's intuitive reaction to what's disturbing about this fact of submission? Well, in order to assess this view, I think it's helpful to draw a distinction between two rather different ways of thinking about labor markets. I think of these as American attitudes toward labor markets and European attitudes towards labor markets. The American attitudes see the labor market as justified and the rights that individuals have to direct other people's labor as justified broadly in terms of ownership rights, such that bosses are permitted to tell their staff how to act because bosses have created the jobs using their own property, whether that's material property or their entrepreneurship, for example. And this gives them a certain kind of control over their staff. Now, if you have this American view of labor markets in mind, Lisa's worries look really forceful, I think. It's really easy to see why in a labor market in which bosses get to do what they like with their workers, at least within the remit of, the broad remit set by, for example, employment law, then that fact of submission does look deeply worrying. But what if we have a more European attitude towards labor markets? I think Europeans tend to see labor markets as justified in terms of the nature of the social cooperation that they promote, such that bosses have authority over their staff only to the extent that that authority is exercised responsibly to achieve certain valuable ends. So it's not that labor markets are viewed in property right terms, but instead as promoting certain valuable outcomes through the coordination that they achieve. And that means that bosses within these European-style labor markets don't just get to do what they like, but they have to exercise their authority in ways that serves the purpose of the institution. I think that this difference between American attitudes and European attitudes is really important. And I'm struck when I read work by, for example, Elizabeth Anderson, by the incredibly US-focused nature of the writing. And I worry that Lisa's opposition to submission might be drawing illicit force from this American type attitude when there's the European alternative. So here's more specifically what I have in mind. On the European type approach, bosses are constrained by their responsibility to exercise their workplace power according to certain normative standards. With their power comes responsibility. Viewed in this way, possessing workplace authority is not an unambiguous blessing, but it can be a curse as well. So, for example, if my boss in my department said, Tom, I'm worried by the fact that I have all this power in the department, and so I'm going to empower you to make an important decision. In particular, Tom, I would like you to decide which 10% of the department will be fired. If my boss gave me that offer, I would not think, wonderful, thanks so much for empowering me to determine the fate of 10% of my colleagues. I would say, no way. If you want me to have to make those kinds of decisions within the workplace, you're going to have to pay me a damn sight more than you currently do. That is, for me at least, a certain kind of decision-making within the workplace, because it comes with a responsibility to exercise that power in a particular way, is something that individuals might reasonably prefer to avoid rather than to have. So I worry that it's too easy to treat submission as an unambiguously bad thing, whereas for some individuals in some circumstances, they might regard that as the preferable situation to be in. So that's the first challenge to Lisa. Second, Lisa's defense of workplace democracy is, I think, pretty brief. I think that the appeal to workplace democracy crops up at various points in the chapter, but the central defense of it occurs in about one page, maybe a page and a half, around the end of page 67, parts of page 68. And I think that is because Lisa regards workplace democracy as having a kind of self-evident appeal, and much of the work is to be done in exploring the force, or as Lisa believes, lack of force, in the very many objections that are leveled against workplace democracy. So quite quickly, for example, Lisa considers the possibility that workplace democracy might produce very inefficient results. And she considers whether that's the case and whether it be problematic or not. I think that there's much to be recommended in that approach. And I think Lisa is right that there is lots of work to be done in working through those objections. But I think it does leave some questions unanswered relating to why Lisa favors workplace democracy. In particular, it would be useful, I think, to hear a little bit about whether she favors an instrumental approach, a non-instrumental approach, or both. I ask this question because debates about whether democracy is valuable for instrumental reasons, non-instrumental reasons, or for both categories of reasons. This is a really lively dispute within democratic theory at the moment, with lots of writers voicing different kinds of accounts of what might be non-instrumentally valuable about political democracy, for example. And it would be helpful for me, I think, to understand Lisa's view a little bit better, to know whether she had more instrumental or non-instrumental sympathies. I think there are some reasons to believe that Lisa favors a non-instrumental justification for workplace democracy. And this is because of the role of submission and in particular, the relevance of the fact that, or the relevance of her appeal to the fact that workers have to be or for many workers, that they are subject to workplace hierarchy and authority. So it might well be that the relevance of submission is direct for Lisa, in the sense that she is concerned by the submission that workers have to their bosses, and that this fact in itself provides a reason for workplaces to be democratic. If that's correct, and she favors the non-instrumental view, then challenge one that I described becomes especially important, because it becomes important not only to the diagnosis, but also the prescription. However, there are also some parts of the chapter that suggest a more instrumental justification for workplace democracy, and in particular, Lisa's discussion of the empirical facts and the relevance of claims about inefficiency, for example. That suggests that there are more instrumental considerations playing a role in Lisa's thinking. So I think it's a little bit unclear. It's not a major problem for Lisa's view, but I would quite like to hear more about the theoretical foundations of her support for workplace democracy. Okay, on to challenge 3. So Lisa defends workplace democracy by showing that some commonly stated objections to the proposal lack empirical support. These are, as I've noted, concerns about the efficiency of the outcomes of democratically organized workplaces. I'm broadly sympathetic to this aspect of what Lisa says, but I do worry that her presentation of the empirical literature risks being one-sided. So, for instance, Lisa notes that fears about the deleterious economic consequences of workplace democracy, overstated. There was some influential work in the 1980s by economists who believed that workplace democracy would result in underinvestment in long-term strategies. And there's been lots of recent empirical work that shows that that's false. And I think Lisa is right to draw attention to that. However, I think even-handedness seems to require that we also acknowledge the limitations of what we can infer from the evidence as well. So let me be more specific. There is a large body of labor economics that has emerged in the past 5 years, mainly quantitative research drawing on data from Finland and Germany in particular, that seeks to explore what the effects of workplace democracy have been on worker outcomes. So in a really influential study by Simon Jaeger and Shakad Noy, who are both at MIT and Benjamin Schofer at Berkeley, drawing on a data set of about 20,000, they reached the conclusion that existing co-determination arrangements, their data is from Finland, are mild, mostly benign institutions with non-existent or small positive economic impact. So that what they show is that the benefit of co-determination on worker outcomes in Finland it's positive, but it's very minimal. That kind of finding from labor economics, we find replicated across a bunch of studies. So again, Simon Jaeger and Ben Schofer are really the leading figures in this. And I've just cited some of their work here. And so a second problem, and let me go on to a second problem, sorry. The second problem is, I think Lisa at some points risks being sanguine in her interpretation of the positive potential of workplace democracy. So she claims, for example, on page 71, that collective bargaining can benefit more vulnerable individuals, such as women with care responsibilities or members of minorities who individually have weaker bargaining power. As a matter of theory, that might well be correct. But I worry again that when we turn to the empirical literature, we find slightly different results. So in particular, what we see is a well-documented problem called the insider-outsider problem, which is basically that collective bargaining benefits the interests of its own members, especially core members, and individuals who sit on the periphery of those institutions tend to miss out. So there is, this is work by David Rueda, a political economist, a comparative political scientist and economist, who's documented these insider-outsider problems across a range of domains, and collective bargaining is just one of those. For that reason, I think it's unsurprising that when you look at the empirical literature, stronger trade unions are associated with they basically damage women's rate of employment more than men's. So stronger union power, increased union density, it does not, I think, benefit women with caregiving responsibilities more than men, as Lisa suggests. So again, I think this is just about acknowledging some of the complications around the appeal of collective bargaining. So the upshot, let me be clear, is not that we need to abandon workplace democracy. Rather, what I'm suggesting is that our support for workplace democracy must be sensitive to these limitations and to the costs of this strategy. My own view then is that in the light of this empirical evidence, if we are to be enthusiastic for workplace democracy, we should have at least dampened enthusiasm that recognizes the risks of this strategy and assigns it at most a limited role in ameliorating the most urgent labour market injustices. So I'm curious to know what Lisa makes of that empirically informed challenge to the defence of workplace democracy. Finally, I'm conscious of time, the fourth challenge, when reading the chapter in the defence of workplace democracy, I was struck by the possibility that at least some of the injustices that Lisa describes might be ameliorated by better or more heavy investment in familiar elements of the welfare state that could be leveraged to achieve more wide-ranging reform. So, for example, when you talk with labour economists about what we can do to improve the employment prospects of the least advantaged, many of them will cite recent work by Raj Chetty, who presumably will win the Nobel Prize within the next couple of years for his work on the importance of racial inequality and investment in education. Similarly, we might think that reforms to unemployment benefits, perhaps basic income, for example, these kinds of measures could greatly improve individuals' bargaining power so that they had a meaningful say over the structure of the jobs that they completed. I think if Lisa is skeptical of the potential of these more familiar policies to achieve these results, then it would be valuable, I think, to hear more about what she regards as the shortcomings of these more familiar responses. And as an advocate of these more familiar responses, I want to suggest that they have much more appeal than perhaps is recognized in the chapter. Now, Lisa might respond to this by saying, aha, Tom, I have no principled or practical opposition to the additional economic measures that you describe. We should welcome them alongside greater workplace democracy. They are complementary rather than rival approaches, such that we can be allies. Final words. I think that under some conditions, it's a mistake to regard ourselves as allies here, since at least sometimes workplace democracy and the more familiar institutional responses that I endorse can pull in separate directions. This is because measures that focus on distributing the benefits within firms or even within sectors, as Lisa prefers, they can worsen inequalities across firms. So if you have more collective bargaining happening at the sectoral level, as Lisa thinks, for example, then incredibly wealthy sectors, individuals who work in incredibly wealthy sectors might benefit from that. But individuals who work in poorer sectors will stand to lose from this. If you work in a poor sector where your earnings can be boosted, but only to a very minimal degree, after all, there's not much money floating around in the sector, then there's going to be little hope for you to gain much by collective bargaining at the sectoral level, at least in comparison with policies that operate at the state level, which have the potential to redistribute resources and funds from the wealthiest sectors to the poorest ones. And I just have an empirical paper there that documents some of these kind of concerns. So I think there are cases in which our proposals do pull in different directions. But second, even if that's not the case, I want to suggest that still there's something troubling about the endorsement of workplace democracy here, given that, if the labor economists are correct, this is a mostly benign institution whose effects are very mild. And that is, I think, that given the seriousness of the injustices we face, advocating for such a mild solution really risks missing the point. A little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I worry that proponents of workplace democracy, they're akin to someone offering paracetamol during childbirth, when what's really needed is an epidural. Sure, the paracetamol might make some small difference, but surely that misses the point, when what we need is much more radical reform in this domain. Okay, thanks very much. I'll leave it there. I really look forward to discussing this with Lisa and hearing other people's reactions.
Thank you so much, Tom. So this was wonderful and really dense. So Lisa, you now have 5 to 10 minutes to try to provide a comment, and then we'll open for the Q&A.
Well, thank you so much. Fantastic comments. Okay, let me start at the beginning. It's interesting what you said about American versus European conceptions, and I would say it's not just attitudes, it's also legal structures and cultural habits. So it's really pretty deep. And I would say, I mean, this is a longer discussion. We would have to have the European perspective is the right one. But that doesn't mean that hierarchy understood along the model you described, where it comes with responsibilities and with, you know, a certain orientation towards a certain function and so on. That, in my view, doesn't mean that it shouldn't be held to account in some way or another. And that it's true that there can, I mean, that I was making my own job harder here by imagining what would be the kind of worst case situation from my perspective that I can imagine here. And that's one that has actually been studied empirically also. Assume you have a cooperative instead of hierarchy, and the cooperative needs to dismiss people. And that is, empirically speaking, I mean, I've read a few case studies that it's really difficult because people need to decide, okay, who's going to lose their job? But then again, they can, if they want to, appoint a committee or even one person if they think that's the, you know, the best placed person to make those decisions. But I think in a way, this is just a morally difficult situation. And I mean, we could have a separate conversation about why people get fired and so on. But sort of assuming that hierarchies just dissolve it for us doesn't really do justice to the moral depth of what's really at stake here, I would say. So in that sense, I appreciate what you're saying about the responsibility. But I think, oh my, that's maybe a bit too personal. But okay, I was first appointed dean, and so I didn't, fortunately, don't have to dismiss people. But you know, you have to take decisions that are sometimes unpleasant for people. And then after 2 years, we had a kind of informal agreement procedure, and I feel much more legitimized in having to make hard decisions, having the trust of my colleagues who say, we want you to do this job, together with others, of course, rather than having to make the decision about a team when my only legitimacy comes from someone else who has no idea what's going on there. So I would say, even, you know, from the subjective perspective of someone having to carry that responsibility, it's actually better if there are democratic accountability mechanisms than if you don't have them. And I don't know whether it deserves higher pay. That you mentioned this in passing, that, you know, you would want to have more money for taking on that responsibility. That's a separate question we could discuss. I'm not so sure. Oh yeah, no claims about deserts. Good idea. Instrumental or non-instrumental justification of workplace democracy. I think there's a non-instrumental case to be made, but you also need to respond to worries about instrumental counter-arguments. And that's also my approach to democracy in general. I think there's a sort of a core non-instrumental justification, but we also want the kind of system to be, to reach its goals in a way that is not completely dysfunctional. And that's where the instrumental justifications then also come in. And they are particularly important also in today's situation where, okay, we still have market competition, and so many companies might think, okay, could we ever afford this? And then the conversation about the instrumental benefits and, is it in any way thinkable that you would survive democratizing your company in today's market situations? That's where the instrumental questions become really very important. Now, on the empirical research, so I would say I've read the Jaeger and Haryu studies and so on. They are right to say that the economic impact is limited, but it's benign. So I think that's important because in the American context, and that was my sort of imagined target audience, people just don't know this, that it's actually mild but benign. But I'm interested in the non-economic impact. And that's something that Haryu and others don't measure. That's just not part of their setup. They look at wages and work time and these kind of things. I'm interested in how do people relate to each other? So the kind of stuff that the spillover argument looks at. Do people experience their workplaces as collegial? Does it make them better citizens in one way or another? There is also a lot of empirical research on that at the moment, and the evidence is a bit mixed in the sense that you do definitely find effects from what people experience at the workplace to how they behave politically. I think that's undeniable, but there are different channels of influence here. One line is, okay, if you experience workplace relations positively, that makes you a better citizen, so that's the spillover line. But there is also another one which says, if you have a really bad experience at your workplace, that might actually activate you politically, and then it would be the opposite, and that sort of muddles the waters here. And also, when you talked about the insider-outsider problem, I mean, yes, I don't want to clarify too much, but what I would want to say there is that I'm not presenting democracy as workers' democracy as the one solution to all problems. And I do talk about anti-discrimination policy and also the job guarantee. And if those came together, it might also change the dynamic of insider-outsider problems. One might also say here, I'm not quite sure whether I really ultimately believe this, but it's an interesting argument. One person's modus tollens is another person's modus ponens. A lot of the problems between men and women is because women are not unionized, or they are in jobs where the unions are weaker. Maybe if that is the problem, we need to have universal membership in unions, as Mark Reef has argued, in order to address these imbalances. So I would say I definitely don't want to see it as, the one hammer that can hit all nails, and it needs to be understood in combination with other measures. I would fully agree that we need more experiments in order to understand what really works in practice under what conditions, and what could make it more than a mild measure. And I think the codetermination studied in the papers you mentioned is never full parity. Codetermination is always, I mean, in Germany, most companies have quasi-parity, and in Finland, it's also less than 50% of the votes in the relevant bodies for the worker representatives. So in that sense, it's also not surprising that it doesn't have such a big effect if you only give workers limited voice. But as I said, what I'm more interested in is the non-economic effects ultimately. Now, what about the rest of the welfare state? I'm actually fully with you, but I have not had time to present the chapter on the fight against inequality. So that's also there in the book. But one of the reasons for why I think workplace democracy is so important is that it can contribute to really a fundamental shift in understanding what it means to be a citizen, to also have the citizen right at work, and a fundamental power shift in also what people can demand. And I do want it to go hand in hand with other measures. I've become a little bit disillusioned about trying to fix everything with educational measures. I don't want to deny that they're hugely important, but that at the moment this only covers people's early lives, and for the rest of their lives, what are we supposed to do? So I think that's important, but we shouldn't put all our cards into that basket, as it were. But in that sense, I do agree that there may sometimes be strategies, concrete implementation issues where you do get different things pulling apart. But in general, I would say that we need these different things to come together. And I mean, you talked about traditional elements of the welfare state. I'm not against this, but I think shifting from unemployment support to a job guarantee plus still unemployment support for those who don't want it. I don't want it to be mandatory. That would be an element of the welfare state, but a more innovative one, if you like, which could sort of build a bridge also to workplace democracy, because these forms of publicly subsidized work should then also have reasonably democratic participatory structures. And so in that sense, I would hope that we can be allies here, and maybe there are some issues where you get different directions, and then you have to decide, depending on the the political situation on the ground in a country, what's more important in a certain situation. But overall, I'm very much with you that other changes need to happen as well. And yet, I think if people could get more politically activated and have an opportunity to exercise their citizen skills at the workplace, that could also have a much more powerful effect on many other areas of life and to get us the kind of things that you want us. But of course, it's a chicken and egg thing. What's first? I'll stop here to make sure others can also speak.
Hey, Lisa. So we now have some time, 15 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to stop recording because, as I said, we don't record the Q&A.